Hi everybody. Today what we're going to do is we're going to learn about paragraph shrinking. And with paragraph shrinking, all we're doing is taking what we read in a text and we're kind of breaking it down into smaller parts so that we can really focus on what we're reading without having to read everything over and over and over again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you guys how to paragraph shrink Grandma's House by Rachel Howard. So when we look at this first, I'm kind of looking through and seeing that it looks like it might be a little bit of a longer article. And so what I want to do is kind of break this up into about 6 chunks max. You don't want to break it up too much and have so much that you have to work on. So I'm thinking about, I'm going to start at the beginning, and what we do with our paragraph shrinking is we're going to highlight the first line of each chunk. So I'm going to start with, the sun was just peeking through the curtains in Emily and Hannah's room when their mom called upstairs to wake them. "It's time to go to Grandma's," she said. Emily groaned and looked over at her twin sister, who was rubbing her eyes. "I don't want to go to Grandma's house," Emily said grumpily. "Me neither," Hannah said. She sat up and stretched. "But maybe Uncle Joe will be there." Uncle Joe was their favorite. He always brought them chocolate chip cookies from the bakery he owned. "Yeah, maybe," Emily said. She hated going to their grandma's house. It smelled like an old person, and there was plastic on all the couches, which stuck to their legs whenever they wore shorts and tried to get up. Their grandma was also very deaf, so they had to talk right in her ear whenever they needed to tell her something. Mostly when Emily and Hannah went over to their grandma's house, they whispered to each other and let their mom talk to Grandma. So I'm thinking maybe this is a good part to have this be my first chunk. So I'm just going to write a number 1 there beside here. And I'm thinking that my next chunk is probably going to start right down here. So when you chunk your text, you just kind of want to put parts of it together where the story is kind of talking about the same thing. So it makes it easier for us to understand. All right, so my second chunk is going to start right here with the first line. So I'm going to put a 2. Hannah went to the bathroom to brush her teeth, and Emily reluctantly got out of bed. She got dressed quickly and went downstairs for breakfast. Their mom was sitting at the table with a steaming cup of coffee and a newspaper in front of her. "Morning, Em," she said. "Hi, Mom." Emily pulled out the cereal. She and Hannah liked and poured 2 bowls before sitting at the table next to see their mom. "Excited to see Grandma?" "Yeah, kind of," Emily said in between bites. She knew it would hurt her mom's feelings if her mom knew how uncomfortable she was at their grandmother's house. It was better not to tell her. Okay, so I think that's probably going to be the end of my second chunk. And I think that I'm going to start chunk 3 right here. Hannah came running down the stairs and started eating quickly, shoving the cereal into her mouth. So remember, the beginnings of our chunks we're going to highlight. "Sorry I'm late, Mom." Emily rolled her eyes. Hannah was always the good one. She was even wearing a nice dress to go to Grandma's house. Emily looked down at her old jeans with holes at the knees and the lumpy sweater she had pulled out of her closet. "You're not late," their mom said. She closed the newspaper and took a long drink of coffee. "I really appreciate you guys going over to Grandma's today. I have a ton of Christmas presents to buy, and I know Grandma will appreciate the company." Hannah smiled, but Emily felt in her stomach drop. They would be at Grandma's house alone? Emily finished her breakfast slowly and took her empty bowl to the sink. All right, so I think I'm gonna start my next chunk right here because it looks like the story's gonna change a little bit. So I'm gonna start with, bye, the mom called, waving from the car before she drove away. Emily and Hannah walked up the long driveway to their grandma's house. This is going to be so weird, Emily said. It'll be fine, Emily. Maybe Grandma will let us watch TV, Hannah said, swinging her arms. Emily didn't understand why Hannah was so optimistic. Grandma, like their mom, didn't believe in television. When they got to the front door, Hannah rang the bell. They could hear the loud ring reverberate through Grandma's house and had to wait a long time until they heard Grandma's shuffling steps walking to the front door. Hi, girls, Grandma said. She opened the door, and Hannah and Emily walked in dutifully, kissing her on the cheek as they passed into the dark house. They waited in the foyer, not knowing where to go or what to do. After their grandma had locked the door carefully, they followed her into the kitchen, where they all sat at the table. Okay, I think I'm gonna stop my fourth chunk there and start my fifth chunk kind of right here. So, this will start chunk 5. Are you girls hungry? Grandma said, looking from one to the other. Emily wasn't sure if she could tell them apart, but she and Hannah shook their heads. Okay, well, there's something I want to show you, Grandma said. Will one of you go get that album over there? She pointed to a thick brown photo album that was on the kitchen counter. Hannah got up and brought it to the table, placing it right in front of Grandma. Their grandma opened the album and the spine cracked. These are pictures of your mom when she was a little girl, Grandma said. Hannah moved closer to Grandma, and even Emily was curious. She pushed her chair closer to Grandma's and looked over to her shoulder as she showed them pictures of their mom's childhood. Okay, I think I'm going to start chunk 5 right here. All right, so this will be chunk 6. A few hours later, they heard a loud honk, which meant that their mom was back to pick them up. Emily and Hannah hugged their grandma, and for the first time, they felt really close to her. As they walked down the long driveway, Hannah grabbed Emily's hand. That wasn't so bad, was it? She said. No, Emily said. She smiled at her sister. When they got in the car, Emily thought about how she and Hannah had noticed their mom had the same way of raising one eyebrow when they were happy. Today, she had noticed that Grandma had the same habit too.